He belongs among the most talented players ever to come to the major leagues.
He played with abandon, reckless abandon.
Leo Durocher later said about him that he was the only player he ever saw that was better than Willie Mays.
Gillette presents the World Series between those amazing Brooklyn Dodgers and the powerhouse New York Yankees. This is Red Barber. Yes, baseball's 1941 World Series. This is beyond a doubt the greatest crowd ever to see a World Series ball game.
1941 was an exceptional baseball year. It was the year of Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak. It was the year that Ted Williams hit 406.
So let's see who's here. Mighty Babe Ruth, young Phil Rizzuto and jolting Joe DiMaggio, Tommy Henrich and Pee Wee Reese.
Names that are legends today, and the name of one legend who has become virtually forgotten.
Pete Reiser. That name is R-E-I-S-E-R, Reiser in center.
It's interesting because Pete Reiser's year is somewhat overlooked. Pete Reiser had one of the greatest years ever in baseball.
And I mention him because he led his league the first time up, a sensational thing for any rookie to do. And you might not think it from the All-Star game, but I don't think anything bothers that fellow. He just takes that lumber up there and wears pitchers out.
Pete Reiser could do it all. He holds the record for running to first base, 3.2 seconds. He could run, and he could hit, and he could throw.
Now here's Reiser. He's been up twice. He's had one hit. The first pitch, he hits a high fly ball into right field. Right fielder Henry goes back against the scoreboard. It's going to hit. It's a home run right on top of the fence and over. It's a home run, and the Dodgers lead 4-3.
He was only 22 years old. He led the league in batting with a .343 average, and he led the league in 5 or 6 other offensive categories, including doubles and triples and runs scored and on-base percentage. Plus, he was a great base runner.
The day that we were there, the first game, Pete Reiser was like the superhero of the day. He made these 2 or 3 catches. He was sliding into this base. He stole a base, had a couple of hits, and it was then that I decided that he was my favorite. You could just tell by the grin on his face and the way he just played all out. And he said too, if he had to go in with his spikes up, he would go in. He was batting maybe 380, close to 400, before he really got hurt.
Throws. Reiser swings at about.
I think he would have become one of the all-time greats if he hadn't got hurt.
Pete Reiser's first full year in the big leagues was 1941. He was 5 games into the season when he got beamed seriously by Ike Pearson of the Phillies. And that was one of 12 times in his baseball career that he was carried off the field in a stretcher. When he came back, he was still suffering from dizziness. Durocher wanted him in the dugout and wanted him in uniform, sort of as, I guess, an inspiration to the rest of the players. And he promised not to use him, but they were in a tie game with the Phillies. It was 7-7 in the 8th or 9th inning, and Durocher motioned for Reiser to pinch hit, and Reiser jumped right up and got a bat and hit a grand slam home run to win the game 11-7. Could barely make it around the bases, but did make it around the bases and hit the game-winning grand slammer.
I'm not the guy who cared about love.
Durocher and Reiser were probably a bad combination because they both were exceedingly competitive and both wanted to win at all costs.
And now let's watch the way Leo gets the team into shape and into the headlines.
Come on, Sandlot. How do you go this way? Come on!
Lippy Leo Durocher. If you play for Durocher, you've got to have pepper and plenty of moxie.
Where are you playing? Get over there!
He'll ride the pants right off a greenhorn.
Oh, now look, you haven't got a bucket of paint with you on third base, you know. You've got to get the paintbrush out of your hand. Now break you in right.
Reiser started in 1942 as a house of fire and was hitting .380 into early July, leading the league in a number of categories. And the Dodgers were 10.5 games in front of the Cardinals and were running away with the pennant. All that changed July 2nd when the Dodgers were playing the Cardinals in Sportsman's Park. With the Cardinals at bat in the bottom of the 12th, Enos Slaughter hit a line drive to deep center field, and Pete Reiser ran back at full speed and reached up and tried to catch the ball and ran full force into the concrete wall. He ended up with contusions and actually bleeding through his uniform, unconscious, and carted off the field and ultimately to the hospital. That was the first really serious outfield wall collision that Reiser had. And I think that was just sort of a harbinger of what was to come. Pete Reiser was one of 12 children born to a working-class family in St. Louis. He was a baseball prodigy. When he was 15, went to a tryout camp that the St. Louis Cardinals were holding. Cardinals had probably 600-700 minor leaguers under contract at any given time, and they stockpiled these kids. It was a way that Branch Rickey, he was president of the Cardinals, developed the Cardinals, and one of the reasons the Cardinals were so good for so many years. It turned out that they signed a lot of them illegally. Even then, you were supposed to wait till a kid was out of high school before you signed him, and Branch Rickey and the Cardinals signed a lot of kids before they were out of high school, including Pete Reiser. And when the commissioner of baseball, Judge Landis, got wind of this, he ordered about 100 of the Cardinals' minor leaguers, including Pete Reiser, to be released. Of course, Reiser was an amazing raw talent at the time, and the Cardinals really did not want to lose him. And Branch Rickey had a relationship with Larry MacPhail, who was the president of the Brooklyn Dodgers. So they concocted this under-the-table deal where the Dodgers would sign Reiser, and then at some future time, then the Dodgers would quietly sell Reiser back to the Cardinals, and he'd be the Cardinals' property again. But the deal didn't work out that way. Leo DeRocher saw him in spring training in 1939. That was the spring training in which Reiser hit 3 home runs, 5 singles, and 4 walks in 3 games, and batted something close to 500 for about 30 spring training games. The Dodgers really were pretty much forced to keep him. When Reiser joined the Dodgers in 1940, they had been a second division team for many, many years. The last pennant had been in 1920. They were more known as the Daffiness Boys. Once ended up with 3 guys on third during the 1930s. They were somewhat the laughingstock of the National League. With DeRocher as the manager and Larry MacPhail as the president, things were changing. And then when Reiser had such a tremendous year in 1941, he really propelled them into the pennant race.
Conquering heroes returning to Brooklyn with the first National League championship that Flatbush has seen in 21 years.
So the Dodgers all of a sudden were a force to be reckoned with.
Well, how do you feel about those coming games at the Yankee Stadium?
Well, we have a good chance. I think we can beat them.
And he played the same way with a glove on his hand instead of a bat. Make spectacular catches, climbing the fence. That's what he was doing. And then he ran directly into that center field fence and hurt himself. But he did it all. And that's why DeRocher was so high on him.
Reiser ended up with a concussion and a fractured skull from his collision with the wall in St. Louis. And he talked Dr. Hyland, physician in St. Louis, into letting him take the train back to Brooklyn. What Dr. Hyland didn't know was that Reiser had planned to get off in Pittsburgh. He got off the train and took a cab and went to the ballpark, and DeRocher happened to see him in the stands and told him to get his uniform on. He said, I won't play you, but just come sit in the dugout. So the game ends up going 14 innings. And in the top of the 14th, the Dodgers are out of players, and it's a tie game. They've got the winning runs on base. And DeRocher says, can you hit? And Reiser says, sure. Lines a base hit over the second baseman to drive in the winning run. And Reiser rounds first and collapses and is, again, rushed to the hospital, this time in Pittsburgh, and is out for a good period of time.
Pete was missed in the clubhouse when he was on the disabled list. You know, in those days, the disabled list was confined to just a few players. Today, there are hundreds on it. But in those days, if you were on the disabled list, you went into the trainer's room, got on the table, let him work on your ankle or your elbow or whatever, and the players would walk by that room and look in and say, "How is she today, Doc? How is she?" In other words, it was a real letdown to be on the disabled list. But today there are hundreds. But Pete Reiser had a special locker because of his eminence as a player. He had the best locker in the clubhouse. And when he was gone, the players would walk by. "How you feel today, Pete?" Awaiting his return to our lineup.
Reiser said in later years that he thinks that he cost the Dodgers the pennant in 1942 by coming back and trying to play when he shouldn't have played. Well, Pete's back from the war in 1946. An interesting thing happened near the end of spring training. As the Dodgers got off the train, there was a reporter, and he asked Reiser, "Where do you think you're going to finish at 46?" And Reiser said, "Probably Peck Memorial Hospital." Pete proved to be prescient because that's exactly where he ended up at the end of the season.
He's here with his manager, Leo DeRocha. He had fractured his ankle, and here he's crashing into the wall at Wrigley Field, ivy-colored wall at Wrigley Field.
However, he still had great speed, and he stole 34 bases that year to lead the league. And what's perhaps even more remarkable is he stole home 7 times. These were straight steals of home, in which he simply beat the pitcher pitch to home plate. Pete, in 47, got off to a good start and showed some of his old brilliance. He was fielding well and hitting well above 300. The story's been often told about the petition that some of the Dodger ball players from the South circulated to tell Branch Rickey that they didn't intend to play with the black ball player. Some of them asked Reiser to sign their petition. And of course, Reiser's from St. Louis, which is many would consider a very southern town. The story is that Reiser refused to sign the petition, relating a story that when he was in the military, his daughter was ill. And late at night, they needed a doctor, and they were new to the area, and they didn't have a pediatrician. And so they just called one up out of the phone book, and the doctor said, "Come on over." And it turned out to be a black doctor, and so he took care of Pete's daughter, and he asked the Dodger, who was one of the Dodgers, what he would have done in that situation, and the Dodger from the South said, "Well, I would have left." And Pete said, "Well, I think you're a damn fool, and I'm not going to sign your petition." And the Dodgers were in the thick of the pennant race.
And we're playing in Ebbets Field, and a ball was hit to center field, and whoever hit it, it looked like a home run. Pete Reiser, our center fielder, started chasing it. And unfortunately, he didn't get to it. He got to the wall and ran into that wall and fell in a clump in center field on the ground. And his injuries were serious.
He had forgotten that Dodgers had moved the fences in center field from 420 feet to 390 feet to add more seating in the outfield bleachers. It's important to remember that in those days there were no warning tracks and the fences weren't padded. So if you ran into a fence in a big league ballpark, it was probably made out of concrete. And this was a very serious injury. They actually gave Reiser last rites in the clubhouse.
I was crying with my girlfriend. We hid behind the chair in the living room. We were crying, both of us.
To Yankee Stadium comes the biggest series crowd in baseball history for the opening game of the 44th World Series.
By the time the World Series came along, Reiser was able to play.
He pitches. Reiser swings. Ground ball hit back to Shea has it. Robinson is trapped between second and third. Shea throws to Rizzuto, who then tags Robinson out.
Robinson does enough artful dodging to allow Reiser to reach second.
Shea now pitches to Dixie Walker.
Dixie Walker pokes out a single, and in comes Reiser with the first run of the series. The Dodgers go ahead 1-0.
Bert Schotten, the Dodgers manager, started him in Game 3. However, in the second inning of that game, he slid into second base trying to break up a double play and didn't get up. And everybody rushed out. And x-rays after the game showed that he had a hairline fracture in his ankle. He talked the doctor into not putting a cast on it, but just wrapping it. Because he wanted to continue to try to play in the World Series.
Jackie Robinson, Brooklyn's rookie.
The next day was Game 4 of the series, and that's the famous game in which Bill Bevins of the Yankees took a no-hitter into the 9th inning against the Dodgers in Ebbets Field.
In the 3rd inning, Jackie Robinson draws his second straight walk.
Game 4 was, I think, the most exciting single moment that I was ever around in a baseball ballpark. Bill Bevins of the Yankees had gone to 2 men out in the last of the 9th inning and hadn't given up a hit. And no pitcher by an inning had ever gone that far in the World Series. He needed 1 more out to pitch the first no-hit game in the history of the World Series. And he was leading in the ball game 2 runs to 1. And he had 2 men on base.
Bert Schotten, because of his bad ankle, inserted Reiser as a pinch hitter in the 9th inning with 2 outs. And a guy on first, and Al Gianfrido was on first base and promptly stole second. And when he stole second, the Yankees manager, Bucky Harris, had Reiser intentionally walked. And so Reiser ends up on first base, and Gianfrido's on second. 2 outs. Cookie Lavagetto comes to bat in one of the most dramatic World Series games of all time.
Here's the pitch. Lavagetto swings. There's a line drive to right field. The ball bounces off the wall. Lavagetto races down to second, scoring Gianfrido and Mixus. The crowd goes wild in a sensational 3-2 victory over the Yankees.
They later asked Bucky Harris why he walked Reiser in that situation with first base open, because Reiser couldn't run and, in fact, had a broken ankle. And Harris said he could still hit, and I was afraid of allowing him to hit in that situation. So even on one leg, Reiser got an intentional pass.
I think he would have become one of the all-time greats if he hadn't got hurt. That's what ended his career. Everybody in baseball knew what kind of ability he had. He could do it all.
They said he had the abilities, he had the arm, then he was hurt. He lost the throwing arm that he had. He had the speed. The injuries really cut into his career.
One of his defenses to running into the walls was that they were always in key situations, in key situations in ball games where, the catch meant maybe perhaps winning or losing the game. But of course, that's still a fairly myopic view of it. If you're going to maim yourself and you lose yourself to your team for the rest of the season, maybe it's better to lose that particular ball game and be there the next day.
I suppose if there had been very heavy padding on some of the places where he hit the wall after jumping, perhaps that could have made a difference. But, all kinds of things happen with athletes who are highly competitive and who want to win.
One of his answers that he often gave was, well, when the ball was hit, I thought it was my job to catch it. And he was clearly a real competitor. And I think it was just inbred in him to go all out all the time.
When people asked him, why were you hustling so much that you got hurt, and after you did get hurt, why didn't you let up a little bit? So he said he couldn't play any other way and live with himself.